What they don't tell you about the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is not just a conflict. It is not just a land dispute. It is not just politics. It is trauma. It is memory. It is identity. And it's one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented issues in modern history. Fade in, images of checkpoints, refugee camps, ancient stone cities, prayer at the Western Wall, children playing in rubble, journalists ducking gunfire. For over a century, the land known to some as Israel and to others as Palestine has been at the center of a storm, a relentless whirlwind of wars, peace talks, failed negotiations, and international finger-pointing. Most people think they know the story. But what if most of what you've heard is only part of the truth? This is not a video to take sides. It is an invitation to dig deeper, ask harder questions, and expose what many powerful voices would rather leave unsaid. What you're about to see may challenge what you thought you knew. It may unsettle you. But history does not become clearer by avoiding the uncomfortable. Let's begin. A brief history of the land. To understand today's headlines, we must first go way back. Thousands of years before tanks, drones, and ceasefires, there was just land. And people. The ancient foundations. The land now called Israel and Palestine lies at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. For millennia, it has been inhabited by diverse peoples: Canaanites, Hebrews, Philistines, Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and Greeks. In the 10th century BCE, the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judah emerged, ancient Jewish civilizations whose presence is recorded in both religious texts and archaeology. But these kingdoms were not permanent. They fell to conquering empires, first Babylon, then Persia, and later Rome. Under Roman rule, Jewish revolts led to destruction and diaspora. In 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem. By 135 CE, most Jews were expelled. This marked the beginning of nearly 2,000 years of exile, the Jewish diaspora, Islam, Christianity, and the new identity of the land. In the 7th century CE, Arab Muslims conquered the region. It became known as Bilad al-Sham, part of Greater Syria under the Umayyad, Abbasid, and later Ottoman empires. Jerusalem, or Al-Quds in Arabic, became the third holiest site in Islam. Over the centuries, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived here, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, but rarely in the kind of existential conflict we see today. The land was not empty. It was home to Arabs, Muslims, and Christians who saw themselves as part of a broader Arab identity, speaking Arabic, living in cities like Jaffa, Acre, Jerusalem, and Hebron. United Kingdom, the British entered the scene. Fast forward to the 20th century. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The League of Nations handed Britain control of the area, called the British Mandate for Palestine. Here's where things begin to change. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a now famous letter, the Balfour Declaration, promising the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Yet at the same time, Britain had made conflicting promises to Arabs for independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. To the Palestinian Arabs, who made up about 90% of the population at the time, this was betrayal. The rise of Zionism. Meanwhile, in Europe, a movement called Zionism had been growing. It was founded in the late 1800s by Theodor Herzl, who argued that Jews could never be safe in Europe and needed a state of their own. After centuries of pogroms and persecution, especially under the Russian Empire, and later the horrors of the Holocaust, many Jews looked to Palestine as the answer. Zionist immigration increased in waves. First Aliyah, 1882 to 1903, mainly Eastern European Jews escaping persecution. Second Aliyah, 1904 to 1914, more ideologically driven settlers establishing collective farms, kibbutzim. Third and fourth Aliyah, 1920s, 30s Jews fleeing rising European anti-Semitism. Tensions grew between Jewish immigrants and Palestinian Arabs, who feared they were being replaced and that their land was being taken without consent. The Arab Revolt. From 1936 to 1939, Palestinian Arabs launched a mass revolt against British rule and increasing Jewish immigration. The British brutally suppressed it, using airstrikes, mass arrests, and even public hangings. Thousands of Palestinians were killed or imprisoned. This revolt failed, but it left a legacy of bitterness and fragmentation within Palestinian society. World War II and the Holocaust. Then came the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany. The world was horrified, and for many, this confirmed the Zionist claim. Jews needed a safe homeland. Survivors flooded into Palestine. But by this time, Britain was overwhelmed and desperate to leave. In 1947, they turned the problem over to the newly formed United Nations, the UN Partition Plan. The UN proposed dividing Palestine into two states: a Jewish state with 55% of the land, an Arab state with 45%. A Jerusalem would be international. The Jewish leadership accepted. The Arab world rejected it, arguing it was unjust to give a minority population, mostly recent immigrants, the majority of the land. Civil war broke out. Violence spiraled. The Nakba, the catastrophe they don't teach in school. If there is one event that defines the Palestinian experience more than any other, it is the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe. It is not just a moment in history. It is a living wound that continues to shape every dimension of Palestinian identity, politics, and resistance. But ask most people outside the region, and they've never even heard of it. So let's break it down, clearly, honestly, and historically. What was the Nakba? In 1948, the State of Israel was officially declared. But for Palestinians, this wasn't a celebration of independence. It was the beginning of their dispossession. Between 1947 and 1949, over 750,000 Palestinians, more than half of the Arab population of historic Palestine, were forcibly expelled or fled from their homes in what is now Israel. More than 500 towns and villages were depopulated, destroyed, or repopulated with Jewish immigrants. Entire communities vanished. Family homes were taken. Crops, livestock, and ancestral lands gone. What remained was a scattered people, many in refugee camps, others living as second-class citizens, and some in exile to this day. This mass displacement wasn't a side effect of war for many Palestinians. It was the deliberate result of Zionist strategy. Was it ethnic cleansing? This is a controversial question, but one that many historians, including Israeli scholars, now explore with clarity. Let's be clear. The Zionist movement aiming to establish a Jewish homeland faced a demographic challenge in historic Palestine, where the majority were Arab. As early as the 1930s, some Zionist leaders recognized that creating a Jewish majority state would require a transfer of the native Arab population. Documents now declassified, including those examined by Israeli historians like Elon Papp and Benny Morris, show that during the 1948 war, numerous military operations were designed not just to defeat Arab forces, but to clear Palestinian villages and prevent the return of their residents. In some cases, residents fled violence. In others, they were driven out forcibly. Villages like Deir Yassin witnessed massacres. In Deir Yassin, over 100 civilians were killed by Zionist paramilitaries, including women and children. The news spread fear, causing panic and flight. After the war, Israeli laws were passed to confiscate the land of the absentees, Palestinians who had been forced out, making their return virtually impossible. Today, Israel denies the right of return to these refugees, even while allowing Jews from anywhere in the world to migrate and claim citizenship. So yes, for many legal scholars and historians, what happened in 1948 fits the definition of ethnic cleansing. Why is it still so controversial? Because the Nakba shatters the sanitized version of Israel's, founding the image of a brave new democracy born in the desert, surrounded by hostile neighbors. It complicates the Western narrative, one that often views Israel as the eternal victim of Arab aggression. But history isn't binary. You can acknowledge the trauma of the Holocaust and still recognize that the creation of Israel involved the dispossession of another people. You can support Jewish safety without denying Palestinian suffering. Yet for decades, many Western schools, media outlets, and governments have refused to engage with the Nakba narrative, calling it propaganda, anti-Israel, or simply ignoring it altogether. In some cases, like in Germany or France, even mentioning the Nakba at pro-Palestinian rallies can lead to police bans or accusations of extremism. The ongoing Nakba. The Nakba is not a closed chapter. It is not history, it is ongoing. Every time a Palestinian home is demolished in East Jerusalem, every time a village is bulldozed in the West Bank, every time Gaza is bombed into rubble and not rebuilt, it is part of the continuation of the Nakba, the denial of refugee return, the confiscation of ID cards, the siege of Gaza, the legal designation of Palestinians as present absentees, people in their own homeland who have no right to their property. This is not just about 1948. It's about a process of erasure that continues in real time, how the Nakba shapes the modern conflict. Understanding the Nakba is essential to understanding why Palestinians resist and why there has been no peace. For Palestinians, the conflict isn't about land swaps or security guarantees. It's about a demand for justice, for recognition of what was taken, and accountability for how it was taken. And that's where the problem lies. Most peace plans proposed over the decades have tried to build forward, without addressing what happened behind. They say, let's move on. But how can you move on if your entire people were uprooted, and that uprooting is never even acknowledged? Why the Nakba matters to the world. The Nakba challenges us all because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths of modern nation-building, colonial legacies, and how power shapes memory. It's a mirror for the West, where the stories of indigenous peoples, refugees, and the colonized are often buried beneath national myths. And it asks a bigger question. Whose pain do we recognize? Whose history gets to be remembered? For Israel, the Holocaust is sacred memory, and rightly so. But for Palestinians, the Nakba is sacred memory too. And until the world recognizes that, there can be no honest conversation, let alone reconciliation. The rise of Zionism, a movement, a myth, and a misunderstood history. To understand the Israel and Palestine conflict, we must go back even further than the Nakba to a movement that began in Europe in the late 1800s. Zionism. Zionism is one of the most powerful, controversial, and misunderstood ideologies in modern history. To some, it was a liberation movement. To others, it was settler colonialism cloaked in survival. So what is Zionism really? Where did it come from? And why does it matter so deeply even now? Let's take a deep dive. 1. What is Zionism? At its core, Zionism is the belief that the Jewish people are a nation and that they deserve a national homeland, specifically in Palestine, the historic land of Zion. The term Zionism comes from Zion, a biblical word referring to Jerusalem and the land of Israel. But this wasn't just a religious idea. In fact, modern political Zionism was secular. Its founder, Theodor Herzl, was not a rabbi. He was a journalist and writer in Vienna, deeply disturbed by the growing wave of anti-Semitism in Europe. After witnessing violent anti-Semitic riots and the notorious Dreyfus affair in France, where a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason, Herzl came to a conclusion. Jews would never be safe in Europe. They needed a state of their own. In 1897, Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress in Switzerland. There, Zionists laid out their goal: to establish a publicly and legally secured home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But there was a problem. Palestine was not empty. 2. The land without a people myth. Zionist leaders promoted a powerful slogan: a land without a people for a people without a land. It sounded poetic. It was also completely false. Palestine in the late 19th century was home to hundreds of thousands of Arabs, Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in cities like Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, and in farming villages across the countryside. Travelers and records from the Ottoman era confirm that this land was not barren or uninhabited. It had bustling trade, agriculture, and culture. But this myth served a purpose. It helped justify the idea that Jews could settle in Palestine without displacing anyone. It erased the people who already lived there. And that erasure laid the foundation for future conflict. 3. Early Jewish immigration to Palestine. Between 1882 and 1948, several waves of Jewish immigration, known as Aliyot, brought Jews from Europe and the Middle East to Palestine. Some came fleeing persecution, especially from Tsarist Russia and later Nazi Germany. Others came as ideological pioneers, seeking to build a Jewish society based on agriculture, labor, and nationalism. They established kibbutzim, communal farms, Hebrew schools, and a parallel economy and political structure. But tensions quickly grew with the Arab population. Why? Because early Zionist settlements often excluded Arab labor, bought land from absentee Ottoman landlords, and then evicted the Palestinian tenant farmers who had lived there for generations. The newcomers were not simply neighbors, they were building a separate society, one that openly sought to become the dominant one. 4. Palestinian reaction and British colonial role. By the early 20th century, Palestinian Arabs were increasingly alarmed by Zionist ambitions. And they were right to be. Zionist leaders, in both private writings and public speeches, made it clear: Their goal was not to live side by side in a binational state. Their goal was to establish a Jewish-majority nation-state in a land where Jews were a small minority. As Jewish immigration increased, Arab protests turned into uprisings, notably the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a massive rebellion against British colonial rule and Zionist expansion. And here's where things get even more complicated. The British, who controlled Palestine after World War I, made three conflicting promises. To the Arabs, they promised independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. To the Zionists, they promised a national home through the Balfour Declaration of 1917. To the international community, they claimed they would protect all inhabitants equally under their mandate. In reality, they sowed division, suppressed Palestinian resistance, and increasingly backed Zionist institutions. This colonial mismanagement laid the groundwork for catastrophe. 5. The shift from political to settler Zionism. By the 1940s, especially after the Holocaust, Zionism gained more urgency and support. But it also became more militant. Zionist paramilitary groups like the Irgun and Lehi, Stern Gang, began attacking both British forces and Arab civilians to push their agenda. In 1946, the Irgun bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people. In 1948, members of these groups carried out the Deir Yassin massacre, killing over 100 Palestinian villagers in cold blood. These acts weren't just fringe violence. They were part of a strategy to drive Palestinians out and establish irreversible facts on the ground. This shift marked the transition from a political movement to a settler colonial project, where land acquisition, population transfer, and military force became central tools. 6. Why Zionism is so controversial today. Today, many people still defend Zionism as a national liberation movement, a justified response to centuries of Jewish persecution, culminating in the horrors of the Holocaust. But critics argue that Zionism, as implemented, came at the expense of another people, the Palestinians, who became the price of Jewish self-determination. This is where the core tension lies. Can a Jewish ethno-national state exist without discriminating against non-Jews? Can a settler project based on exclusive rights to land be reconciled with democracy and equal rights? Modern Israel calls itself both Jewish and democratic. But for millions of Palestinian citizens, refugees, and those under occupation, that promise rings hollow. This is why many Palestinians, and a growing number of Jews and international observers, reject the ideology of Zionism altogether. Not because they deny Jewish suffering, but because they believe freedom cannot come at the cost of another's. 7. Zionism versus Judaism, not the same. This is a crucial point. Zionism is not Judaism. Judaism is a 3,000-year-old religion and culture. Zionism is a political ideology barely over a century old. Many Jews, both secular and religious, opposed Zionism from the beginning. Ultra-Orthodox Jews like the Neturei Karta continue to oppose the state of Israel on religious grounds, believing only the Messiah can restore Jewish sovereignty. Others, especially leftist Jews, oppose Zionism as a racist, colonial, or apartheid ideology. So when people criticize Zionism, it is not necessarily anti-Semitic. The problem is equating Jewish identity with a political project, one that has committed and continues to commit grave injustices against another people. Why this chapter matters. Understanding the history and ideology of Zionism is essential to making sense of the modern conflict. Zionism is not a myth, but it has used myths about empty lands, peaceful coexistence, and historical destiny. It is not evil, but it has produced violent consequences, especially for Palestinians. It is not monolithic, but it is powerful and deeply embedded in Israeli law, identity, and foreign policy. If we're going to talk about peace, justice, or solutions, we have to begin by understanding where it all started. And that story begins not in 1967 or 1948, but in the ambitious, messy, and painful birth of Zionism. The hidden roots of a century of struggle. We've just taken a hard, unfiltered look at the foundations of one of the world's most explosive conflicts. From the global silence surrounding British betrayal, to the catastrophic displacement of over 750,000 Palestinians in the Nakba, to the rise of Zionism as both a movement of survival and a mechanism of dispossession. This isn't ancient history. It's the living DNA of a struggle that continues to shape global politics, media narratives, and everyday lives across Israel, Palestine, and beyond. If we want to truly understand what's happening today, from the West Bank to Gaza, from the halls of the UN to the streets of Jerusalem, we need to confront the truths that textbooks and headlines often ignore. And we're just getting started. Don't miss part 2 of this series, how the partition, war, and founding of Israel set the stage for decades of occupation. Subscribe, share, and stay tuned, because the truth is too important to look away.